The moment she walked through my office door, I knew exactly who she was. 25 years had passed, but I would have recognized those eyes anywhere, the same eyes I see in the mirror every morning. Eyes I had inherited from the woman who left me behind without a second thought when I was just 5 years old. She didn't recognize me. Why would she? The last time she saw me, I was a small, frightened child clutching a worn teddy bear as she walked out the door. Now I sat behind a gleaming mahogany desk, the CEO of one of the fastest-growing tech companies in the country. The little girl she'd abandoned had grown up, had survived, had thrived. Despite her, not because of her. Her resume said Margaret Wilson, but I remembered when she was Margaret Calloway, my mother. She'd remarried, taken a new name, perhaps built a new life with a new family. I wondered if they knew about me. I wondered if she ever thought about the daughter she'd left behind. I'd known this day was coming. 3 weeks ago, her application had crossed my desk during our latest round of administrative hiring. I could have easily rejected it, could have spared myself this moment. But something stopped me. Something dark and wounded that had lived inside me for 25 years whispered, "Let her come." So here she was, 62 now, silver threading through her once dark hair, smile lines at the corners of her eyes, evidence of years of laughter and joy I hadn't been around to witness. She wore a conservative navy suit, hands clasped nervously in her lap as she waited for me to finish reviewing her resume. She had no idea who I was. "Ms. Wilson," I said, my voice betraying nothing of the storm raging inside me. "Your qualifications are quite impressive." "Thank you," she replied, her voice sending a jolt through me, the same voice that once sang me lullabies. "I've worked in administrative support for over 20 years. I pride myself on efficiency and discretion." Discretion. The word nearly made me laugh. Was she discreet when she packed her bags while my father was at work? When she left nothing but a hastily scribbled note? When she disconnected her phone and disappeared from my life without a trace? "Tell me," I said, leaning forward slightly, "there's a gap in your employment history, between 1998 and 2000. May I ask what you were doing during that time?" A flicker of something, discomfort perhaps, crossed her face. "Personal matters, family issues. I suppose that's one way to describe abandoning your child." "I see," I replied, making a note. "Well, Calloway Tech prides itself on being thorough." Her eyes widened slightly at the company name. "Calloway? That's an unusual name." "Yes," I agreed. "It's my father's name. I kept it professionally." She nodded, but I could see no recognition in her eyes. Why would there be? She had left when I was too young to bear any strong resemblance to the adult I would become. And the name Alexandra was common enough. She probably never connected Alex Calloway, CEO, with the daughter she'd abandoned. "Well, Ms. Wilson, your experience aligns well with what we're looking for. We need someone to manage administrative tasks for our executive team. It's demanding work with high standards. Do you think you're up for it?" "Absolutely," she said with conviction. "I'm known for my attention to detail and discretion. I understand the importance of supporting busy executives." I smiled, but it didn't reach my eyes. "Excellent. The position reports directly to me. We keep long hours here sometimes. Will that be a problem?" "Not at all. My children are grown." Children, plural. So there were others. Siblings I'd never meet who got to keep her, who hadn't been discarded like an unwanted toy. "Perfect," I said, closing her file. "HR will be in touch with the details, but I think we can make this work." Relief washed over her face. "Thank you, Ms. Calloway. You won't regret this." But I already did. As I watched her walk out of my office, my hands began to shake. 25 years of abandonment, of questions, of nights spent wondering why I wasn't enough to make her stay. It all crashed over me like a tidal wave. I barely made it to my private bathroom before emptying the contents of my stomach. What had I just done? The rational part of my brain screamed that this was a mistake, that I should call HR immediately and find a reason, any reason, not to hire her, that allowing my mother to re-enter my life, even under these circumstances, would only reopen wounds that had never fully healed. But another part of me, the wounded 5-year-old who still lived somewhere deep inside, whispered something else. Make her know. Make her understand what she did. Make her sorry. I splashed cold water on my face and stared at my reflection. Same dark eyes as hers. Same high cheekbones. Same full lips. How had she not seen herself in me? Or had she and simply not cared? "She didn't recognize you," I whispered to my reflection. But she will. That's when I decided. I wouldn't tell her who I was, not right away. First, I would let her work for me. Let her experience me as her demanding, exacting boss. Let her curry my favor, seek my approval, depend on me for her livelihood. And then, when the time was right, I would let her know exactly whose life she had walked back into. I straightened my posture, adjusted my designer blazer, and walked back to my desk. I had a company to run, and now I had a plan. The first memory I have of my mother leaving isn't actually of the day she walked out the door for good. It's from a year earlier, when I was 4. We were at a department store. I was looking at a display of stuffed animals while she browsed through a rack of clothes nearby. At least, that's where she was supposed to be. When I turned around, clutching a stuffed rabbit I wanted to show her, she was gone. Panic set in immediately. I ran up and down the aisles, my little heart racing, tears streaming down my face as I called for her. I don't know how long I searched. Time means something different to a terrified child. But eventually, a store employee found me and took me to the front desk. They paged her name over the intercom. She appeared 15 minutes later, looking annoyed rather than worried. "Alexandra, there you are," she said, sighing as if I had been the one who wandered off. "I was just in the next department over." The store employee gave her a disapproving look. "Ma'am, your daughter was quite upset. She's been looking for you for some time." "She's fine," my mother replied dismissively. "She knows better than to wander off. Don't you, Alexandra?" I nodded, sniffling, still clutching the stuffed rabbit. I didn't argue. Even at 4, I knew better than to contradict my mother in public. "Can I have this?" I asked in a small voice, holding up the rabbit. She glanced at it with disinterest. "Put it back. We're leaving." I did as I was told. I always did as I was told, hoping that being good would make her happy, make her want to stay with me. It never worked. Now, 25 years later, I sat in my corner office staring at the employee file for Margaret Wilson, née Calloway, and remembered that stuffed rabbit. I remembered the feeling of abandonment, the terror of being lost, the hurt when she acted as if it had been my fault. It was a preview of what was to come. My father and I never really talked about the day she left for good. It was as if speaking about it might somehow make the pain more real. But I remember it with crystal clarity. It was a Tuesday. I know because I had just started kindergarten, and Tuesdays were show-and-tell days. I'd brought my teddy bear, the one Dad had given me for my birthday, and told my class that he kept the bad dreams away. Mom was supposed to pick me up that afternoon, but it was Dad who was waiting outside the school, his face drawn and pale. "Where's Mommy?" I'd asked as he helped me into the car. "She had to go away for a while, Alley Cat," he'd said, his voice strange and tight. "When is she coming back?" He didn't answer right away, just started the car and pulled away from the curb. "Let's talk about it at home, okay?" At home, I found her closet empty, her drawers cleaned out. Her perfume bottles were gone from the bathroom counter. It was as if someone had carefully excised her from our home, leaving barely a trace that she'd ever been there. Dad sat me down on the couch and tried to explain, but how do you tell a 5-year-old that her mother doesn't want her anymore? That she's chosen a different life, one that doesn't include her own child? "Your mom needs time to herself," he'd said, struggling for words. "She loves you very much, but she's not going to be living with us anymore." Did I do something bad? I'd asked, because in the logic of a child, what other explanation could there be? "No, Allie. No." He'd pulled me into his arms then, and I felt his tears on my hair. "You didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes grown-ups just change. It's not your fault. It's never your fault." But I didn't believe him. I couldn't. If I hadn't done something wrong, why would she leave? The note she left was addressed only to my father. I wasn't supposed to read it, but years later, as a teenager, I found it in his desk drawer. It was brief and cruel in its simplicity. "David, I can't do this anymore. This life, it's suffocating me. I never wanted to be a mother. You knew that, but you convinced me it would be different once she was here. It wasn't. I've tried for 5 years, but I can't pretend anymore. Don't try to find me. I don't want to be found. Margaret, no, I'm sorry. No, take care of our daughter. No, tell Alexandra I love her." Nothing but the stark truth that she had never wanted me at all. I stared at Margaret Wilson's employee file and felt that old familiar pain rise up like bile in my throat. She had walked out of my life without a backward glance. And now, unwittingly, she had walked right back in. My intercom buzzed, jolting me from my memories. "Ms. Calloway, your 2 o'clock is here," my current assistant's voice announced. "Thank you, Rachel." "Send them in." I closed the file and slipped it into my desk drawer. And Rachel, please inform HR that I've approved the hire for the new administrative position. Miss Wilson can start on Monday. Yes, ma'am. I'll let them know right away. I took a deep breath and prepared to meet with my next appointment, pushing thoughts of my mother to the back of my mind. I had built Callaway Tech from the ground up, turning my father's small software consulting firm into a major player in enterprise solutions. I wouldn't let her presence distract me from running my company. But even as I smiled and shook hands with the venture capitalists interested in our newest product line, a part of my mind was already formulating a plan for justice or revenge or closure. I wasn't sure what to call it yet. All I knew was that Margaret Wilson was about to discover what it meant to be at someone else's mercy. The weekend before my mother was set to begin working at Callaway Tech, I didn't sleep. I paced my penthouse apartment, alternating between rage and panic, questioning and reaffirming my decision to bring her into my life. Sunday night, I called the one person who knew everything, my father. You did what? His shock was evident even through the phone. I hired her, Dad. She applied for an administrative position, and I approved it. Allie ... He sighed, and I could picture him removing his glasses to rub the bridge of his nose, a gesture he'd made countless times throughout my childhood when he was worried or stressed. Why would you do that to yourself? I don't know, I admitted, sinking onto my sofa. When I saw her application, I couldn't just ignore it. I had to see her. And she didn't recognize you? No, it's been 25 years, Dad. I was 5 when she left. A long silence stretched between us. Finally, he spoke again. What are you hoping to get out of this, Allie? Closure? Answers? Revenge? Because I'm not sure any of those things will heal what she did to you. To us. Maybe all of the above, I whispered. I need to understand why it was so easy for her to walk away. And yes, maybe a part of me wants her to know what it feels like to be vulnerable, to depend on someone who holds all the power, like a 5-year-old depends on her mother. He said quietly, yes. The admission felt both shameful and liberating. Just be careful, Alley Cat. Don't let this consume you. You've built an amazing life, a successful company. You did it without her. Don't give her the power to hurt you again. I won't, I promised, but even as I said it, I knew it might be a lie. By bringing her into my world, I had already given her that power. After we hung up, I went to my home office and pulled out an old photo album, one of the few tangible connections I had to my early childhood. There weren't many pictures of my mother. After she left, Dad had removed most of them. But there were a few from my early birthdays, a family trip to the beach, ordinary moments that belied the fractures beneath the surface. In one photo, taken when I was about 3, she was holding me on her lap. She wasn't looking at me, but rather somewhere off camera, her expression distant even as her arms encircled me. I had never noticed that detail before, how even when she was physically present, she seemed to be elsewhere. I closed the album and returned to my bedroom, finally falling into a fitful sleep around 3 a.m. In my dreams, I was 5 again, running through endless department store aisles, calling for a mother who had no intention of answering. Monday morning arrived with a clarity I hadn't expected. I woke before my alarm, the anxiety that had plagued me all weekend mysteriously absent. In its place was a cold, steady resolve. I dressed with particular care, selecting a charcoal Armani suit and Louboutin heels, an armor of success and power. My makeup was flawless, my dark hair swept into a sleek chignon. I looked every inch the CEO I had become, a woman who commanded respect. A woman nothing like the abandoned child I had once been. My driver arrived at 7:30 a.m. to take me to the office. I preferred to arrive early, before most of the staff, to have quiet time to prepare for the day. But this morning was different. This morning, Margaret Wilson would be arriving for her first day, and I wanted to be there when she did. HR had scheduled her orientation for 8:30 a.m. She would spend the morning with them, learning company policies and procedures, setting up her benefits, getting her security badge. After lunch, she would be brought to the executive floor to begin training with Rachel, who would be moving to our new satellite office in Chicago in 2 weeks. Perfect timing. Just enough days for Rachel to train her, for her to settle in, before she would be working directly with me, without a buffer. I arrived at the office by 8 a.m. and busied myself with emails and reports. At 8:35, I received a message from security that Margaret Wilson had checked in. My heart rate kicked up a notch, but I forced myself to remain focused on work. The morning crawled by. I had meetings with my CTO and marketing team, approved the final designs for a new product launch, and reviewed quarterly projections, all while acutely aware that somewhere in the building, my mother was being introduced to the company I had built. At 1:15 p.m., my intercom buzzed. "Miss Calloway, Rachel is here with Margaret Wilson for training," my receptionist announced. "Send them in." I straightened the items on my desk and took a deep breath. The door opened and Rachel entered, followed by my mother. Margaret looked nervous but eager, dressed in a simple but elegant navy dress with sensible heels. She carried a leather portfolio, new from the looks of it. She'd prepared for this job, was taking it seriously. "Ms. Calloway, this is Margaret Wilson, our new executive administrative assistant," Rachel said. "Margaret, this is Alexandra Calloway, our CEO. "We've met," I said smoothly, standing to shake her hand across the desk. Her grip was firm, but her hand was cold. Nerves, probably. "Welcome to Calloway Tech, Ms. Wilson." "Thank you for this opportunity," she replied, her voice steady despite her evident anxiety. "I'm very excited to be here. Rachel will show you the ropes over the next 2 weeks before she leaves for Chicago," I explained. "Pay close attention. This role is vital to the smooth operation of our executive team. I expect perfection. If she was intimidated by my directness, she didn't show it." "Good. I didn't want her to quit before we'd even begun." "Of course," she nodded. "I understand completely." "Excellent. Rachel, please show Ms. Wilson her workspace and begin the training. I have a conference call in 15 minutes, so I'll need the Singapore reports before then." "Right away, Ms. Calloway," Rachel replied, gesturing for Margaret to follow her out. As they left my office, I allowed myself a moment to process what had just happened. My mother had stood in front of me, had spoken to me, had looked me in the eye, and still had no idea who I was. The pain of that non-recognition was both expected and surprising in its intensity, but it also fueled my resolve. She would know me. Soon enough, she would know exactly who I was. The next 2 weeks passed in a carefully orchestrated dance. I kept my interactions with Margaret brief and professional, watching from a distance as Rachel trained her on our systems, introduced her to the executive team, and showed her how to anticipate my needs and preferences. Margaret was a quick study. I had to admit that her resume hadn't exaggerated her capabilities. She was organized, efficient, and seemed genuinely eager to excel in her new role. It was disconcerting to discover that the woman who had failed so spectacularly as a mother could be so competent in a professional setting. On Thursday of the second week, I called Rachel into my office. "How is the training going?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. I had been monitoring their progress closely. "Very well," Rachel replied. "Margaret is catching on quickly. She's already memorized your schedule and preferences. I think she'll do an excellent job." "Good. I'd like her to handle tomorrow's executive meeting on her own. You can observe, but let her take the lead. I want to see how she performs under pressure." Rachel looked surprised but nodded. "Of course. I'll let her know." The next morning, I arrived at the conference room 10 minutes before the scheduled executive meeting to find it perfectly prepared. The temperature was set to my preference, the presentation materials were arranged at each seat, and a carafe of black coffee, no cream, no sugar, just as I liked it, sat at my place at the head of the table. Margaret stood near the door, tablet in hand, ready to take notes. "Good morning, Ms. Calloway," she greeted me. "The team should be arriving shortly. I've sent reminders to everyone." "Thank you, Ms. Wilson," I replied, taking my seat and glancing over the agenda she had prepared. "This looks in order." As the executives filed in, Margaret greeted each by name, directed them to their seats, and efficiently managed the start of the meeting. She took notes throughout, occasionally stepping out to retrieve requested information or materials, always returning precisely when needed. I watched her with a strange mixture of pride and resentment. Where was this competence, this attention to detail, this ability to anticipate needs when I was a child crying for her attention? How could she so effortlessly perform these professional duties when she had found it impossible to perform the basic duties of motherhood? After the meeting, when the executives had filed out, Margaret approached me with her tablet. "I've sent the meeting notes to your email," she said, "and I've scheduled follow-ups with the department heads based on the action items identified. Is there anything else you need?" "No, that will be all," I replied, gathering my papers. Then, almost against my will, I added, "You did well today." Her face lit up with the praise, and something twisted painfully in my chest. Had I ever looked at her like that, desperate for approval? I must have, countless times, only to be met with indifference or irritation. Thank you, Ms. Calloway. I appreciate that. I nodded and left the conference room, retreating to my office where I could process the conflicting emotions churning inside me. This was going to be more difficult than I had anticipated. Not because Margaret wasn't performing well, but because watching her excel was unleashing feelings I thought I had long since buried. The weekend provided a necessary respite. I spent Saturday at the spa trying to clear my head, and Sunday working from home, preparing for the week ahead. Rachel's last day was Monday, and then Margaret would be my direct assistant, with no buffer between us. Monday morning, we held a small goodbye gathering for Rachel. Margaret had organized it, ordering Rachel's favorite pastries and arranging for a card signed by the entire executive floor. It was thoughtful and professionally appropriate, another sign that she was good at her job. As Rachel hugged me goodbye, she whispered, "You're in good hands with Margaret. She really admires you." The irony was almost too much to bear. After Rachel left, Margaret approached my desk, tablet in hand as always. "I've updated your calendar with the changes Rachel mentioned, and I've prepared the briefing documents for your meetings this week. Is there anything specific you'd like me to prioritize today?" "Yes," I said, making a split-second decision. "Cancel my lunch. We're going out." She looked startled but recovered quickly. "Of course. Where would you like me to make reservations? Le Bernardin? Noon. Just the two of us. I like to get to know the people who work directly with me. I'll arrange it right away," she said, already typing on her tablet. As she left my office, I questioned my own motives. Was this part of my plan? Or was I simply curious about the woman who had given birth to me only to walk away? Perhaps it was both. At noon, we took the company car to Le Bernardin. Margaret seemed nervous but composed, dressed appropriately in a conservative dress and jacket. As we were seated at one of the best tables in the restaurant, the perks of being a regular patron, I watched her take in the luxurious surroundings with appreciative eyes. "Have you been here before?" I asked, though I was certain of the answer. This restaurant was far beyond what an administrative assistant could typically afford. "No, never," she admitted. "It's quite impressive." "The sea bass is exceptional," I advised as the waiter approached, "and their wine pairings are impeccable." We ordered, and as the waiter left, an awkward silence fell between us. I had initiated this lunch, so the burden of conversation fell to me. But where to begin? There were a million questions I wanted to ask, none of which I could voice without revealing who I was. "So, Miss Wilson," I said finally, "tell me about yourself. You mentioned you have grown children?" Her face softened at the mention of her children, my half-siblings. "Yes, 2 sons. Michael is 30, and James is 28. They both live on the West Coast now, 30 and 28. So she had started a new family almost immediately after abandoning me. The knowledge was like a knife between my ribs. "And your husband?" I probed, keeping my voice casual. "Ex-husband, actually. We divorced about 5 years ago." "I'm sorry to hear that," I lied. She shrugged slightly. "It was for the best. We had grown apart over the years. But we're on good terms for the boys' sake." For the boys' sake. The words echoed in my head. She had cared about what was best for her sons. Had she ever spared a thought for what was best for her daughter? And before them, did you always work in administrative roles? I asked, steering the conversation dangerously close to the time she had left. A flicker of something, discomfort perhaps, crossed her face. "No, not always. I was a stay-at-home mom when the boys were young. Before that," she hesitated, "I worked various jobs. Nothing as interesting as what you've built here." She was evading. "Interesting. And where are you from originally? Your file mentioned you grew up in Connecticut?" "Yes, Fairfield County," she said, seeming relieved by the change in subject. "But I've lived in the city for the past 20 years or so." 20 years. So she had stayed away for 5 years after leaving us before settling back in New York. I wondered what had brought her back, if she had ever thought about the possibility of running into her abandoned daughter or ex-husband. "What about you?" she asked, turning the conversation away from herself. "Calloway Tech has such an impressive reputation. You must be very proud of what you've built." "Yes," I said, meeting her eyes directly. "I am. My father started the company as a small consulting firm when I was a child. When he retired, I took over and expanded it. He's my role model in many ways." "That's wonderful," she said, with what seemed like genuine warmth. Family businesses are special. You don't see that kind of legacy building much anymore. Family. The word felt like acid on my tongue. Yes, well, it was just the two of us for most of my life. We're very close. The waiter arrived with our first course, providing a welcome interruption. As we ate, the conversation shifted to safer topics, current events, books we'd read recently, the challenges of city living. Margaret was articulate and well-informed, with opinions that were thoughtful if somewhat conventional. By the time dessert arrived, I had learned more about the woman my mother had become, but I was no closer to understanding why she had left. It was maddening to sit across from her, to engage in pleasant small talk, when what I really wanted was to scream, "Do you know who I am? Do you ever think about the child you abandoned?" But I maintained my composure. The time wasn't right yet. I needed to know more, to understand more, before I revealed myself. As we returned to the office, Margaret thanked me for the lunch. "It was lovely getting to know you better, Ms. Calloway. I really appreciate the opportunity to work with someone so accomplished. The pleasure was mine," I replied with a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "I have a feeling we're going to learn a lot from each other. More than she could possibly imagine." Over the next few weeks, Margaret proved herself to be invaluable as an executive assistant. She anticipated my needs, managed my calendar with precision, and handled difficult clients and partners with diplomatic skill. The executive team praised her efficiency and professionalism. On paper, I couldn't have asked for a better assistant, but beneath the professional facade, I was studying her, every habit, every preference, every reaction. I was building a profile not of Margaret Wilson, executive assistant, but of Margaret Calloway, the woman who had given birth to me and then decided I wasn't worth staying for. I began to test her in subtle ways. I would change meeting times at the last minute to see how she handled the pressure. I would request obscure information with tight deadlines. I would send her on personal errands that kept her working late into the evening. Through it all, she remained unflappable, eager to please, determined to excel in her role. Her dedication was almost maddening. Where was this resilience, this commitment when it came to raising her daughter? I also began dropping hints about my past, watching closely for any sign of recognition. My father raised me alone from the time I was 5, I mentioned casually one afternoon as she brought me coffee. It couldn't have been easy for him, managing a business and a child by himself. "That must have been difficult for both of you," she replied with what seemed like genuine sympathy. "My boy's father was very involved after our divorce, but single parenting is incredibly challenging. No flicker of recognition, no connection made. Just professional sympathy from someone who had no idea she was discussing her own abandoned child." Another day, as she helped me prepare for a presentation, I told her, "My childhood home was in Greenwich, Connecticut, not far from Fairfield County, where you grew up." "Oh, what a coincidence," she said with mild interest. "Greenwich is beautiful. Did you enjoy growing up there?" "It was lonely sometimes," I replied truthfully. "Just my father and me in a house that always felt too big." She nodded sympathetically but made no connection. It was as if Alexandra Calloway had never existed before she became a successful CEO in her mother's eyes. The more she failed to recognize me, the more my initial plan evolved. It wasn't enough to simply reveal myself to her, to shock her with the knowledge that she was working for her abandoned daughter. That moment of revelation would be fleeting, a single instance of discomfort that couldn't possibly compare to the years of pain I had endured. No, I needed her to understand the full impact of what she had done. I needed her to experience in some small way what it felt like to be discarded by someone you depended on. And so I began to formulate a new phase of my plan, one that would give Margaret Wilson a taste of what it meant to be abandoned. The opportunity presented itself about a month after she started working directly for me. We were preparing for a major client presentation in Chicago, the same office where Rachel had transferred. It was a critical deal that could significantly expand our Midwest operations. "I'll need you to come with me to Chicago for the presentation," I told Margaret on Monday morning. "We leave Wednesday, returning Friday. Make the arrangements, please." "Of course," she replied, already making notes. "I'll book the flights and hotel right away." Over the next 2 days, she worked tirelessly to prepare for the trip, creating detailed briefing materials, coordinating with the Chicago team, and ensuring every aspect of the presentation was perfect. I could see the pride she took in her work, the investment she was making in this role. Wednesday morning, we met at the airport for our 9 a.m. flight. Margaret had everything organized. Our boarding passes, car service waiting in Chicago, hotel reservations confirmed. She was the model of professional efficiency. The flight to Chicago was smooth, and we spent the time reviewing the presentation and strategy for the client meeting. Margaret offered several insightful suggestions that actually improved our approach. I found myself reluctantly impressed by her business acumen. We checked into our hotel, the Peninsula Chicago, where Margaret had reserved adjoining suites on the executive floor. After settling in, we met the Chicago team for dinner to finalize our strategy for the next day's presentation. Throughout the evening, Margaret charmed the Chicago team with her warmth and competence. They clearly respected her already, despite her short tenure with the company. Watching her network with ease, I was struck by the confidence she exhibited in professional settings, a stark contrast to the woman who had felt suffocated by motherhood. Later that night, as I reviewed the presentation one final time in my suite, there was a knock at the door. It was Margaret, with additional market research she had requested from the New York office. "I thought you might want to incorporate some of these data points into your presentation," she said, handing me the file. "Especially the regional usage statistics. They strengthen our position considerably." She was right. The information would enhance our pitch significantly. "Good thinking," I acknowledged. "This will be useful," she smiled, clearly pleased by the approval. "Is there anything else you need before tomorrow?" "No, that will be all. Get some rest. Tomorrow is an important day. Good night, Ms. Calloway. I'll meet you in the lobby at 7:30 a.m. As she left, I sat with the file in my hands, turning over my plan one final time. Was I really going to go through with this? The rational part of me knew it was petty, perhaps even cruel, but the wounded child inside me, the 5-year-old who had waited by the window day after day for a mother who never returned, silenced those doubts. The next morning, I checked out of the hotel at 6 a.m., leaving Margaret's keycard and a note at the front desk. "Ms. Wilson, something urgent has come up requiring my immediate attention in New York. I've returned on the early flight. Please handle the client presentation on your own. All necessary materials are prepared. I trust you can manage this." Calloway, I took a car to O'Hare and boarded the 7 a.m. flight back to New York, knowing that right about now, Margaret would be discovering that I had left her alone in Chicago to handle a multi-million-dollar client presentation with no warning and no preparation to be the lead presenter. She would be panicking, perhaps even terrified. She would feel abandoned, left to sink or swim on her own when she had expected my guidance and presence. It was a pale shadow of what I had experienced as a child, but it was something, a taste of the fear and betrayal I had lived with. As the plane took off, I tried to ignore the voice in my head that said I was making a mistake. This wasn't just about personal revenge. It was a business decision that could impact Calloway Tech. But I had reviewed Margaret's work. I knew she was capable of handling the presentation, even if she didn't believe it herself. The client would likely be impressed by her knowledge and professionalism, even in my absence. This wasn't about sabotaging the deal. It was about giving Margaret Wilson a lesson in abandonment. My phone pinged with messages as soon as we landed in New York, multiple missed calls and texts from Margaret. I ignored them all as I took a car back to my apartment. Let her feel the panic of unanswered calls, of not knowing what was happening or why I had left. Let her experience even a fraction of the uncertainty I had lived with. Instead of going to the office, I worked from home, monitoring my email for updates from the Chicago team. Around 2 p.m., just as the presentation would be wrapping up, I received an email from our Chicago office director. "Alex, sorry you couldn't make it today. Margaret did an outstanding job with the presentation. The client was impressed with her knowledge of the product and market. They've requested a follow-up meeting next week to discuss implementation details. Looks like we're close to closing this deal. Talk soon, James." So she had succeeded, as I had suspected she would. Margaret Wilson was nothing if not competent in a crisis. I felt a complicated mix of emotions, pride in her performance, satisfaction that the company wouldn't suffer for my petty revenge, and a lingering sense of disappointment that my plan hadn't caused her more distress. But the day wasn't over yet. At 4 p.m., my doorman called to inform me that Margaret Wilson was in the lobby, requesting to see me. I was genuinely surprised. I had expected her to return to New York on our originally scheduled flight tomorrow, not to follow me back immediately. "Send her up," I instructed, curious about what had driven her to track me down at my home rather than waiting to confront me at the office. When I opened the door, Margaret stood there, still in her presentation suit, looking exhausted but composed. There was something in her eyes I hadn't seen before, a mixture of hurt, confusion, and determination. "Ms. Calloway," she said formally, "may I come in? I think we need to talk." I stepped aside, allowing her into my penthouse apartment. She didn't comment on the luxurious surroundings, her focus entirely on the conversation ahead. "The presentation went well," she said, getting straight to the point. "The client was receptive and has requested a follow-up meeting next week." "So I heard," I replied coolly. "James emailed me." She nodded, then took a deep breath. "May I ask why you left without telling me? If there was a genuine emergency, I understand completely. But I received no explanation, just a note instructing me to handle everything alone." Her tone was respectful but firm. She wasn't cowering or apologizing. She was standing her ground, asking for an explanation she felt she deserved. "Does it matter?" I asked, watching her closely. "You handled it successfully from what I hear." "It matters to me," she said quietly. "I've worked very hard to earn your trust, Ms. Calloway. If I've done something to lose that trust, I'd like to know what it was so I can address it." She thought this was about her performance, that I had left because I didn't trust her abilities. The irony was almost painful. "This wasn't about your performance, Ms. Wilson," I said, moving to sit on one of my living room chairs, gesturing for her to do the same. "Your work has been exemplary." She sat across from me, confusion evident on her face. "Then I don't understand." "No," I agreed. "You don't." A moment of silence stretched between us. I could see her processing, trying to make sense of my behavior, of this situation. Finally, she spoke again. "Was this some sort of test?" she asked. "To see if I could handle the pressure? It would be so easy to say yes. To frame this as a business decision, a trial by fire to assess her capabilities under extreme circumstances. But something in me rebelled against giving her that easy out. "How did it feel?" I asked instead. "When you realized I had left without warning? When you understood you were on your own for a presentation you weren't prepared to lead?" She looked startled by the question. "Honestly, I was terrified at first, then angry, then determined to prove I could handle it. Terrified, angry, determined." I repeated her words slowly. Imagine feeling that way not for a few hours before a business presentation, but for years. Imagine being 5 years old and experiencing those emotions because the person you depended on most in the world simply walked away without explanation. Her expression changed, confusion giving way to something like dawning comprehension. "Ms. Calloway, I don't understand what you're saying." "Don't you?" I leaned forward slightly. "Tell me, Margaret, do you ever think about the child you left behind in Greenwich? The 5-year-old girl who waited by the window every night for months, hoping her mother would come back? The child who grew up believing there must have been something fundamentally wrong with her for her own mother to abandon her without a backward glance." All color drained from her face. Her hands, which had been resting calmly in her lap, began to tremble. "Alexandra," she whispered, my name sounding strange on her lips after all these years. "Alexandra Calloway, David's daughter." "Your daughter," I corrected, my voice hard. "The one you decided you never wanted and couldn't pretend to care about anymore. The one you left with nothing but a cruel note to her father." She looked as though I had physically struck her. How long have you known who I was?" "From the moment your resume crossed my desk," I replied. "Margaret Wilson, formerly Margaret Calloway." "Did you think I wouldn't recognize my own mother's name, even with a changed surname? You hired me knowing who I was?" Her voice was barely audible. "Why? To punish me?" "To understand you," I said, though we both knew it wasn't the whole truth. "To see what kind of person could walk away from their child and never look back. And yes, perhaps to give you a small taste of what it feels like to be abandoned when you're counting on someone to be there." She flinched at my words but didn't deny them. For a long moment she sat in silence, her eyes fixed on her hands. When she finally looked up, there were tears streaming down her face. "I have no right to ask for your forgiveness," she said quietly. "What I did was unforgivable. But you should know. Not a day has gone by that I haven't thought about you, haven't regretted what I did." "Really?" I couldn't keep the skepticism from my voice. "You regretted it so much that you never once tried to contact me? Never sent a birthday card, a Christmas gift, a single word to let me know you were even alive?" "I was ashamed," she admitted. "And scared." The longer I stayed away, the harder it became to imagine coming back. How could I possibly explain to a child why her mother had left? What could I say that wouldn't just cause more pain? So you said nothing, did nothing, and built a new family as if the first one had never existed. She winced. It wasn't like that. Michael was born before I left. He was part of why. She trailed off, seeming to realize this was making things worse, not better. Part of why you left, I finished for her. You were pregnant with another man's child when you abandoned me? Is that what you're saying? She nodded miserably. David doesn't know. No one knows except James's father. I had an affair. When I found out I was pregnant, I panicked. I couldn't face David, couldn't bear the thought of him raising another man's child alongside his own daughter. It seemed kinder to make a clean break. Kinder? The word came out as a harsh laugh. You thought abandoning your 5-year-old daughter was the kind option? No, she whispered. It was selfish and cowardly. I told myself I was protecting you from the scandal, from the truth that would eventually come out. But really, I was just protecting myself. I stood abruptly, needing to put physical distance between us. This was not the explanation I had expected. In all my years of wondering why she had left, I had imagined many scenarios: depression, a desperate need for freedom, a fundamental inability to love, but never this. So you traded me for your new family, I said, staring out my living room window at the Manhattan skyline. You chose them over me. It wasn't a choice between you and them, she said, her voice pleading. It was a choice between facing what I had done, hurting your father, disrupting your life with a painful truth, or running away. I chose the coward's path. I've regretted it every day since. I turned back to face her, studying the woman who had given me life and then shattered my childhood. She looked genuinely devastated, the composed professional facade completely gone. But was her regret real, or just a response to being caught, to facing consequences she had avoided for 25 years? Why didn't you recognize me? I asked, the question that had been burning inside me since she walked into my office. How could you look at me, speak to me, work with me every day and not see your own daughter? She shook her head, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. I don't know. Maybe I didn't want to see. Or maybe you're so different from the little girl I remember, so confident, so accomplished. The Alexandra I left was shy and sensitive. You're formidable. I had to be, I said simply. I learned early that vulnerability was dangerous. The words hung in the air between us, the full weight of what she had done to me, how she had shaped the person I had become, crystallized in that simple statement. What happens now? She asked quietly after a long silence. It was the question I had been asking myself since the moment I had seen her application. What did I want from this confrontation? Revenge? Understanding? Closure? Now that I had all three, at least partially, what was the next step? You'll continue working at Callaway Tech, I said finally. You've proven yourself capable, and I won't punish the company by losing a valuable employee over personal history. Relief flickered across her face, quickly replaced by wariness. And beyond that? I don't know, I admitted. I've spent 25 years imagining this moment, constructing elaborate fantasies of what I would say to you if I ever saw you again. But now that you're here, now that I know the truth, I don't know what I want. She nodded, accepting this uncertainty as her due. For what it's worth, Alexandra, I am genuinely sorry. Not just for leaving, but for every birthday I missed, every school event I wasn't there for, every moment of your life that I should have been part of. I know words can't undo the damage I've done, but I want you to know that you were never the problem. The failure was entirely mine. I wanted to hold on to my anger, to keep it burning as it had for 25 years. But as I looked at the broken woman before me, I felt it beginning to transform into something else. Not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps the first step toward understanding. I need time, I said finally. This isn't something that can be resolved in one conversation. We'll continue working together and we'll see where that leads. She stood, gathering her composure. Thank you for giving me that much. It's more than I deserve. As she moved toward the door, she paused, turning back to me with one last question. Does David know? About any of this? He knows I hired you, I replied. Not about Michael or why you really left. That's your truth to tell, not mine. She nodded, accepting this boundary. Good night, Alexandra. As the door closed behind her, I sank back into my chair, emotionally exhausted. The confrontation I had been planning for weeks had gone nothing like I had imagined. The revenge I had orchestrated, leaving her alone in Chicago, seemed petty and insignificant in the face of the truth she had revealed. My mother had abandoned me not because I was unlovable, not because motherhood was suffocating, but because she had made a series of selfish choices and lacked the courage to face their consequences. It didn't excuse what she had done, but it reframed it in a way that, for the first time, allowed me to see that her leaving had been about her failings, not mine. I reached for my phone and called the one person who had never left, who had always been my constant. "Dad," I said when he answered, "I need to talk to you. It's about Mom. There's something you should know. The journey ahead would be complicated, painful, and uncertain." But for the first time in 25 years, I felt a weight lifting, the weight of a child who believed she had somehow caused her mother to leave. Whatever happened next, I would face it not as that wounded 5-year-old, but as the woman I had become despite the abandonment that had shaped me. The revenge I had planned suddenly seemed hollow in the face of the greater victory, finally understanding that I had never been the one at fault. My father arrived at my apartment an hour later. I had poured myself a generous glass of scotch in the interim, an 18-year-old Macallan that I reserved for particularly difficult days. This certainly qualified. When I opened the door, Dad's concerned expression told me he knew this wasn't a routine call. At 68, he still stood tall and strong, though his once dark hair had long since turned silver. The lines around his eyes had deepened over the years, many of them from laughter, but some, I knew, from the pain of raising a child alone after being abandoned. "Alley Cat," he said, using the childhood nickname that only he was allowed to use. "What's going on?" I gestured him inside and toward the living room where I'd set up 2 glasses. "Sit down, Dad. This is going to be difficult." He took the offered seat but left the scotch untouched. "You're scaring me, Allie. Is this about Margaret? Did something happen at work?" I sat across from him, suddenly unsure how to begin. How do you tell your father that the wife who abandoned him 25 years ago did so because she was pregnant with another man's child? How do you rewrite a history that has shaped both your lives? "We had a confrontation," I started, deciding directness was the only way forward. "After the Chicago trip." I left her there to handle the client presentation alone. His eyebrows rose in surprise. "That's not like you, Allie. Your business has always come first." "I know. It was unprofessional, childish even." I took a sip of my scotch, feeling the burn down my throat. But I wanted her to feel what it was like, to be abandoned when you're counting on someone. "It's nothing compared to what she did to us, but you needed her to have a taste of it," Dad finished, understanding in his eyes. "I can't say I approve of the method, but I understand the impulse." I nodded, grateful for his comprehension. She followed me back to New York immediately, came straight to my apartment, and we talked about what happened 25 years ago. "Yes," I hesitated, then decided to just say it. "Dad, she told me why she left. The real reason." He was silent for a moment, his face unreadable. Then he reached for the scotch, took a sip, and set it back down deliberately. "I've had 25 years to imagine why your mother walked out on us, Allie. I'm not sure I need to know the real reason now." "You do," I insisted gently, "because it wasn't what either of us thought all these years. It wasn't that she didn't love us, or that she felt trapped by motherhood, or any of the stories we told ourselves." He waited, his eyes never leaving mine. "She was pregnant," I said finally, "with another man's child. She had an affair, and when she found out she was pregnant, she left rather than face you with the truth." The color drained from his face. For a long moment he sat perfectly still, processing this revelation. Then he stood abruptly and walked to the window, his back to me. "Michael," he said so quietly I almost didn't hear him. "Her oldest son is 30. "Yes," I confirmed. "Born about 7 months after she left us." He turned back to me, his expression a complex mixture of hurt, anger, and something else. Relief, perhaps? "All these years I blamed myself," he admitted. "I thought I had failed her somehow, that I hadn't been attentive enough, hadn't given her enough freedom, enough support. I've carried that guilt for 25 years, Allie." "I know, Dad. I blamed myself, too." He crossed the room and sat beside me on the couch, taking my hand in his. "No child should ever blame themselves for a parent's choices. I tried to tell you that. I know you did, I said, squeezing his hand. But kids believe what they experience, not what they're told. And my experience was that my mother left and never looked back. It's hard not to take that personally. We sat in silence for a few moments, each lost in our own recalibration of the past. Does knowing the truth change anything for you? Dad finally asked. I considered the question carefully. It changes how I understand what happened, I said slowly. It doesn't excuse her actions, but it contextualizes them. She didn't leave because I was unlovable or because motherhood was too burdensome. She left because she made a series of selfish choices and then couldn't face the consequences. That's a healthy way to look at it, Dad said, a hint of pride in his voice. It's taken me 25 years and a direct confrontation to get here, I reminded him. I'm not sure how healthy the journey has been. He smiled sadly. We all find our way through pain in our own time, Alley Cat. So what happens now? With Margaret, I mean. She'll continue working at Callaway Tech, I said. She's actually exceptionally good at her job. Beyond that, I don't know. We left things open-ended. And her sons? Your half-brothers? The words sent a jolt through me. I had been so focused on Margaret as my mother that I hadn't fully processed the reality that I had 2 half-brothers out there in the world, men who had grown up with the mother I had been denied. I don't know about that either, I admitted. One step at a time, I guess. Dad nodded, then asked the question I had been dreading. Would you like me to talk to her? I studied his face, looking for signs of what he wanted. Was he hoping for a reconciliation with his ex-wife? Closure? Or was he simply offering this for my sake? Do you want to? I asked carefully. He considered this for a long moment. I honestly don't know, Allie. For 25 years, Margaret has been this absence in our lives. An almost mythological figure. Finding out she's not only back in New York but working for you, carrying this secret all these years. He shook his head. It's a lot to process. Take your time, I advised. She's not going anywhere. At least not this time. He smiled at that, a small, sad smile. You know, despite everything, I never fully stopped loving her, or at least loving who I thought she was. Finding out she had an affair, that she was pregnant with another man's child when she left, it changes things. Maybe for the better. Maybe it will finally allow me to let go. I hadn't considered that angle, that the truth, painful as it was, might actually be liberating for my father, that it might free him from the what-ifs that had haunted him for decades. Whatever you decide, I'll support you, I promised. Just like you've always supported me. He pulled me into a hug then, tight and secure, the way he had hugged me countless times throughout my childhood when nightmares or cruel classmates or the persistent pain of abandonment had overwhelmed me. You're the best thing that ever happened to me, Alley Cat, he whispered. Don't ever forget that. I felt tears prick at my eyes. Even when I'm being petty and unprofessional by abandoning my assistant in Chicago? He pulled back, his eyes twinkling with unexpected humor. Even then. Though I expect better decision-making from the CEO of Callaway Tech in the future. Yes, sir, I promised, grateful for his unfailing ability to bring perspective to even the most chaotic situations. As he left that night, I felt a strange sense of peace descend. The truth about my mother's abandonment hadn't magically healed the wound of her absence, but it had lanced a festering emotional boil that had been poisoning me from the inside for 25 years. The pain was still there, but now it could finally begin to heal properly. Tomorrow I would face Margaret Wilson, my mother, at the office, and for the first time we would see each other clearly, without the distortions of secrets and lies between us. I slept surprisingly well that night and woke feeling oddly light, as if a weight I had carried for so long I'd forgotten it was there had suddenly been lifted. The revelation of my mother's true reason for leaving hadn't erased the pain of her abandonment, but it had shifted something fundamental in how I understood my own story. As I dressed for work, choosing a deep blue suit that had always made me feel confident, I considered how to approach the day ahead. Margaret and I would be working together closely, as CEO and executive assistant always do. But now, the professional veneer that had separated us had been irrevocably shattered. We were no longer just boss and employee, we were mother and daughter, with 25 years of absence and pain between us. My driver arrived at the usual time, and as we made our way through morning traffic, I gazed out at the city, at the millions of lives intersecting, each person carrying their own complex history, their own secrets and regrets. How many others were walking around with wounds like mine? How many parents had walked away from their children, carrying the shame of their choices like a hidden cancer? At the office, I was half expecting Margaret to have called in sick, to need time to process our confrontation. But when I stepped off the elevator onto the executive floor, she was at her desk, immaculately dressed in a charcoal gray dress, her posture perfect, her expression composed. "Good morning, Ms. Calloway," she said formally as I approached. If someone hadn't known about our confrontation yesterday, they would have seen nothing unusual in our interaction. "Good morning, Ms. Wilson," I replied, matching her professional tone. "I'll need the quarterly projections for the board meeting this afternoon. They're on your desk, along with the revised agenda and the notes from the Chicago presentation," she said. "And Mr. Lawson from legal asked to see you before the meeting. I've scheduled him for 11:30. It was surreal, continuing this professional charade after everything that had been revealed. But perhaps it was necessary, a way for both of us to navigate this new reality without collapsing under the emotional weight of it. "Thank you," I said, heading into my office. The morning passed in a blur of meetings and calls, the normal rhythm of business providing a welcome distraction from the personal turmoil. Margaret and I interacted multiple times, always polite, always professional, never acknowledging the seismic shift in our relationship. It wasn't until lunchtime that the carefully constructed facade began to crack. I had planned to eat at my desk, reviewing materials for the afternoon board meeting, but Margaret appeared in my doorway with a hesitant expression. "Ms. Calloway, I was wondering if we might speak privately for a moment?" I considered deflecting, claiming a busy schedule, but something in her expression, a vulnerability I hadn't seen before, made me reconsider. "Come in," I said, gesturing to the chairs across from my desk. "Close the door." She did as instructed, then sat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, a gesture I suddenly realized I shared when nervous. A small inherited trait I had never known the origin of until now. "I wanted to apologize again for yesterday," she began. "For everything, really. But specifically for coming to your home and forcing a confrontation you might not have been ready for. I think we're well past worrying about timing," I replied. 25 years late is 25 years late, whether it's by a day or a week." She winced but nodded. "Fair enough. I also wanted to ask, about David. Did you tell him?" "Yes," I said simply. She paled slightly. "Everything? Everything you told me. About the affair, about Michael." She closed her eyes briefly, absorbing this. "How did he take it? How do you think?" I asked, unable to keep a hint of bitterness from my voice. "You left him to raise a 5-year-old alone while you started a new family with the man you'd been having an affair with. It wasn't exactly welcome news." "No, I suppose it wouldn't be," she agreed quietly. Does he want to speak with me?" "He hasn't decided," I said truthfully. 25 years is a long time to process an abandonment, only to have the story completely rewritten. He needs time." "Of course," she nodded. "I understand completely." She hesitated, then asked, "And what about you, Alexandra? What do you need?" It was the first time she had used my first name since our confrontation, and it sent a strange shiver through me. No one called me Alexandra except in the most formal of circumstances. I was Alex to friends and colleagues, Allie to my father. Hearing my full name in my mother's voice was disconcerting, a reminder of the intimacy we should have had but never developed. "I need to understand," I said finally. "Not just why you left, but why you never came back. Why you never called, never wrote, never tried to see me even once in 25 years. Having an affair, getting pregnant, those are terrible choices, but they don't explain disappearing completely from your child's life." She looked down at her hands, shame evident in her posture. "After I left, I moved to Boston with James's father, Robert Wilson. We married quickly before my pregnancy began to show. I told everyone Michael was premature when he was born 7 months after our wedding." She paused, seeming to struggle with her next words. "At first I told myself I was giving you and David time to adjust, to heal, that reaching out too soon would only reopen wounds. Then months became a year, then 2, and the longer I stayed away, the harder it became to imagine coming back. That explains the first few years, perhaps, I acknowledged, but not 25 of them. No, she agreed, nothing can justify that. The truth is, Alexandra, I was a coward. The more time passed, the more I convinced myself that you were better off without me, that coming back into your life would only cause more pain. And then what? I prompted when she fell silent. And then I saw you, she admitted. About 10 years ago. You were giving a speech at a tech conference in Boston. I read about it in the business section. Alexandra Calloway, rising star in software development. I went to the conference center, sat in the back of the auditorium. You were so poised, so confident. 20 years old and already accomplished beyond what most people achieve in a lifetime? I stared at her, stunned. You saw me speak? You were there? She nodded. You talked about the future of enterprise software, about your vision for Calloway Tech. Everyone in that room was captivated. I was so proud and so ashamed. What right did I have to feel proud of a daughter I had abandoned? What right did I have to re-enter your life when you were clearly thriving without me? I remembered that conference clearly. It was one of my first major speaking engagements, shortly after I had taken over as CEO from my father. I had been terrified but determined not to show it. To think that my mother had been sitting in that audience watching me, evaluating whether I needed her in my life. That wasn't your decision to make, I said, anger rising within me. You robbed me of the choice. You decided for me that I was better off without a mother. You're right, she admitted. It was selfish, just like everything else I did. I told myself I was protecting you, but really, I was protecting myself from facing the consequences of my actions. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of 25 years of absence hanging between us. Why did you apply for a job at Calloway Tech? I finally asked. Did you know I was the CEO? Yes, she said. After my divorce, I moved back to New York. I was looking for work, and I saw the job posting. I knew it was your company. You've been featured in business magazines. Your photo is on the website. I told myself it was a coincidence, that I was applying because the position matched my qualifications, but truthfully, she hesitated. I think a part of me wanted to see you, even from a distance. To know that you were really okay. And when you got the interview? When you realized you'd be working directly with me? I almost canceled, she admitted. I sat in my car outside the building for 20 minutes, trying to decide if I should just drive away. But then I thought, maybe this was fate giving me a chance to make amends somehow, even if you never knew who I was. I could support you, help you, be of service to you in some small way. But you didn't recognize me, I pointed out. When we met face to face, you had no idea who I was. She shook her head, regret evident in her expression. I don't know how to explain that, except that the Alexandra I left was a small child with pigtails and missing front teeth. The woman across the desk from me was someone else entirely, a powerful, confident executive. And perhaps I didn't want to see the connection. It was easier to pretend you were just my new boss than to face the possibility that I was sitting across from the daughter I abandoned. It was a pathetic explanation, but oddly, I found I could believe it. The human capacity for self-deception was virtually limitless. How many times had I myself chosen not to see uncomfortable truths that were right in front of me? And now, I asked, now that you know exactly who I am, who you're working for? She met my gaze directly for the first time in our conversation. Now I'm here for whatever you need me to be. If you want me to continue as your assistant, I will. If you want me to resign, I will. If you want me to disappear from your life again. Her voice broke slightly. I will, though it would break my heart to leave you a second time. The raw vulnerability in her voice caught me off guard. This was not the distant, emotionally unavailable mother of my childhood memories. This was a woman racked with regret, offering herself up for whatever judgment I deemed appropriate. I don't know what I want yet, I admitted. But for now, I think we continue as we are, professional at work. And slowly, very slowly, we see if there's anything worth salvaging between us personally. Relief washed over her face. Thank you, Alexandra. That's more than I deserve. Yes, I agreed bluntly. It is. But I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it for myself. Because I need to know if the hole you left in my life can ever be filled, or if I've just been carrying around an empty space that nothing and no one can ever occupy. She nodded, accepting both my terms and my frankness. I understand. As she stood to leave, a thought occurred to me. Margaret, I said, using her first name deliberately. Your sons. Do they know about me? She hesitated, then shook her head. No. I never told them they had a half-sister. Another failure on my part. Do you plan to tell them now? That depends, she said carefully, on whether you'd ever want to meet them. They're good men, Alexandra. They would be. Amazed to discover they have a sister, especially one as accomplished as you. The thought of having half-brothers, family I had never known existed, was overwhelming. One step at a time, I said. Let's figure out our own relationship before we complicate it with others. Of course, she agreed readily. Whatever pace you're comfortable with. As she left my office, closing the door quietly behind her, I sat back in my chair, emotionally drained by the conversation. We had covered so much ground, and yet there was still so much unspoken between us, so many years to account for, so many missed moments that could never be recovered. The intercom buzzed, jolting me from my thoughts. Ms. Calloway, Mr. Lawson from Legal is here for your 11:30. I took a deep breath, compartmentalizing the personal turmoil to focus on business. Send him in, I instructed, straightening the papers on my desk. Back to being CEO. Back to the identity I had built for myself in the absence of a mother. The next few weeks established a new rhythm between Margaret and me. At work, we maintained our professional relationship. She was still my executive assistant, managing my calendar, coordinating meetings, handling correspondence with her usual efficiency. But there were small changes, subtle shifts in our interactions that acknowledged the deeper connection we were cautiously exploring. We began having lunch together once a week, usually on Fridays, in a small conference room away from curious eyes. These lunches were awkward at first, neither of us quite sure what to talk about, how to bridge the 25-year gap between us. Tell me about your childhood, she asked during our second lunch, a tentative request that made me laugh without humor. Which parts? I asked. The part where I cried myself to sleep every night for months after you left. The part where kids at school made Mother's Day cards and I had to explain that I didn't have a mother. Or maybe the part where Dad had to learn to do my hair for school pictures, and I went through third grade with the world's most lopsided pigtails. She flinched at each example but didn't look away. All of it, she said quietly. The good and the bad. I want to know who you were, who you became while I was gone. So I told her, not all at once but in pieces, week by week. I told her about the lonely birthdays, the achievements without a mother to witness them, the milestones that felt incomplete. But I also told her about Dad's unwavering support, the close relationship we had developed, the strength I had found in his constant presence. He never spoke ill of you, I revealed. Not once in all those years. Even when I was angry, when I demanded to know why you left, he never said a bad word against you. He just said, sometimes people make choices they later regret. Alley cat. But that's not your burden to carry. Tears filled her eyes at this. He was always a good man. Much better than I deserved. Yes, I agreed without hesitation. He is. In return, she told me about her life after leaving, hesitantly at first, clearly worried that tales of her new family would hurt me, but opening up more when I insisted on hearing it all. Michael was born premature, she revealed, 7 months after I left you. It was a difficult birth. He was in the NICU for weeks. I sometimes thought it was punishment for what I had done to you. Children aren't punishment, I said firmly. Whatever else I believe about you and your choices, I don't believe that. She smiled sadly. You have more wisdom at 30 than I had at twice that age. She told me about her marriage to Robert Wilson, a relationship that had begun as an affair but had settled into a conventional, if not particularly passionate, partnership. About raising Michael and then James in a Boston suburb, about her volunteer work at their schools, about the corporate job she had taken after her divorce 5 years ago. Were you a good mother to them? I asked during one lunch, the question that had been burning inside me. Did you read them bedtime stories and attend their school plays and bandage their scraped knees? Pain flashed across her face. Yes, she admitted. I was present for them in ways I wasn't for you. It's not fair, and I can't explain or justify it. Something in me was broken when you were small. something I didn't know how to fix until it was too late for us. The honesty hurt, but it was also strangely liberating. My mother's inability to parent me hadn't been about me at all. It had been about her own unresolved issues, her own emotional limitations. That knowledge didn't heal the wound of her absence, but it helped me understand that I hadn't been unlovable. She had been incapable of giving the love I deserved. Outside of our weekly lunches, we began to establish small points of connection. She learned that I preferred herbal tea in the afternoons and began bringing a cup to my office without being asked. I noticed she always wore a particular silver bracelet and complimented it one day, which led to her explaining it had been a gift from her sons on her 50th birthday. Small things, inconsequential in the grand scheme of our complicated history, but they were bridges being built across the chasm between us. 4 weeks after our confrontation, my father called to say he was ready to see her. "Are you sure?" I asked, concerned about opening old wounds for him. "You don't have to do this, Dad." "I know, Alley Cat," he replied, his voice steady, "but I think I need to, for closure, if nothing else. 25 years is a long time to carry around unanswered questions." We arranged for them to meet at my apartment on a Saturday afternoon. Neutral territory, private enough for a potentially emotional conversation, with me present as both buffer and support. When the doorbell rang, I opened it to find Margaret looking more nervous than I had ever seen her. She had dressed with careful consideration, a simple blue dress that was neither too formal nor too casual, her hair loose around her shoulders, minimal makeup. She looked both older and somehow more vulnerable than she did at the office. "He's in the living room," I said simply, stepping aside to let her in. She nodded, taking a deep breath before following me down the hall. When we entered the living room, Dad stood from his seat on the sofa, his expression unreadable as he took in the sight of his ex-wife for the first time in 25 years. "David," Margaret said softly, her voice catching on his name. "Thank you for agreeing to see me." Dad nodded, his posture stiff. "Margaret, you look well." An awkward silence fell between them. I moved to sit in an armchair, deliberately creating a triangle between us rather than leaving them directly facing each other. Sometimes the hardest conversations were easier when you didn't have to maintain constant eye contact. "Would anyone like coffee?" I offered, trying to break the tension. "Or something stronger?" "Coffee would be fine," Dad said. "Yes, please," Margaret echoed. I went to the kitchen to prepare it, giving them a moment alone while still being within earshot. When I returned with a tray, they were seated across from each other, still silent, still watching each other with a mixture of wariness and wonder. "It's strange," Dad said as I handed him his cup. "After all these years, all the ways I imagined this moment, I find I don't know what to say to you." "I don't expect you to say anything, David," Margaret replied. "I'm the one who owes you words, starting with, 'I'm sorry, so deeply, profoundly sorry for what I did to you and Alexandra.'" Dad's expression softened slightly. "Allie told me." "About the affair? About Michael? About why you really left?" Margaret nodded, her gaze dropping to her hands. "It was unforgivable. All of it. The affair, the lies, abandoning our daughter. If I could go back and make different choices, I would. But I can't. All I can do is acknowledge the pain I caused and take responsibility for it." "Why him?" Dad asked suddenly. "Was it just physical? Or did you love him?" The question seemed to catch Margaret off guard. I thought I did, at the time. I was unhappy, feeling trapped in a life I hadn't fully chosen, and Robert represented freedom, excitement, possibility. But looking back, I'm not sure it was love. More like escapism. Dad nodded, absorbing this. "And after? Were you happy with him?" A complicated expression crossed Margaret's face. "We had a solid marriage. He was a good provider, a decent father. But no, I wasn't happy, not really. I carried the guilt of what I'd done to you and Alexandra like a stone around my neck. It colored everything. Yet you stayed for 20 years, Dad pointed out. You could have come back, tried to make amends." By the time I realized what a terrible mistake I'd made, it seemed too late, she admitted. "You and Alexandra had built a life without me, and I had 2 more children who needed me. I told myself it would be selfish to disrupt everyone's lives just to ease my own conscience. So instead, you let our daughter grow up without a mother," Dad said, a hint of the old pain surfacing in his voice. "Do you have any idea what that was like for her?" "For me? No," Margaret whispered, tears forming in her eyes. I can imagine, but I know I can never truly understand what I put you both through. The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours, painful and cathartic in equal measure. They talked about the early years of their marriage, about where things had begun to go wrong, about the life they might have had if different choices had been made. Dad spoke of the challenges of raising me alone, of the career opportunities he had passed up to be present for me, of the dating life he had largely set aside to focus on being both mother and father to his daughter. Margaret listened to it all, accepting the pain her choices had caused without defensiveness, occasionally offering context but never excuses for her actions. It was the most honest conversation they had probably ever had, facilitated by 25 years of distance and the perspective that only time can provide. As the afternoon light began to fade, casting long shadows across my living room, a natural conclusion seemed to arrive in their conversation. Not closure exactly, but an acknowledgement that the past could not be changed, only accepted and perhaps finally put to rest. "I won't say I forgive you," Dad said as he prepared to leave. "I'm not sure I'm there yet, but I think I understand better now. And that's something." Margaret nodded, accepting this limited offering with grace. "Thank you for hearing me out, David. It's more than I had any right to expect." At the door, Dad surprised both of us by briefly taking Margaret's hand. "You've raised 2 sons who are presumably good men. And despite everything, our daughter has become an extraordinary woman. Whatever else happened between us, there's that." After he left, Margaret and I sat in silence for a long moment, emotionally drained by the intensity of the afternoon. "Your father is an exceptional man," she said finally. "I didn't appreciate that enough when I had him." "No," I agreed. "You didn't." She looked at me, eyes still bright with unshed tears. "Thank you for arranging this, Alexandra. For giving me a chance to at least try to make amends." "I didn't do it for you," I reminded her. "I know," she nodded. "You did it for him, for closure, and maybe a little bit for yourself, too." She was right, though I wasn't ready to admit it aloud. Seeing my parents together after 25 years, watching them navigate the complicated terrain of their shared history, had fulfilled some deep, childish part of me that had always wondered what it would be like to have both parents in the same room, addressing me as their daughter. "Will you tell your sons about us now?" I asked, changing the subject. She hesitated. "Would you like me to?" It was a fair question, one I hadn't fully resolved in my own mind. Did I want to meet these half-brothers who had grown up with the mother I had been denied? Would it heal something in me to expand my family circle, or would it simply reopen old wounds, confronting me with all I had missed? Yes, I decided in that moment. I think I would. Not right away, but soon. They deserve to know they have a sister. And I think I'd like to know them. Eventually. Relief and something like joy flickered across her face. "They would be so proud to call you their sister, Alexandra. Michael is a pediatrician in San Francisco, and James teaches high school English in Portland. They're good men. You'd like them, I think." The thought that somewhere in the world I had blood relatives, family beyond my father, was still surreal. For 30 years, my family unit had consisted of just Dad and me. The idea that it might expand, that I might gain brothers in my 30s, was both exciting and terrifying. "One step at a time," I cautioned. "Let's not rush anything." She nodded, accepting my pace as she had from the beginning. "Of course, whenever you're ready." As she gathered her things to leave, a question occurred to me, one I had never thought to ask in all our recent conversations. "Are you happy, Margaret? With your life now, I mean?" She paused, considering the question with serious attention. "I'm at peace with some things. My relationship with my sons brings me joy. My work gives me purpose. But happy?" She shook her head slowly. "I don't think I've allowed myself to feel true happiness since I made the decision to leave you. It seemed undeserved." Her honesty was startling. I had expected platitudes, reassurances that she had found fulfillment despite her past mistakes. Instead, she had offered a raw truth, that her choices had damaged not only those she had left behind but herself as well. "That's sad," I said simply. "To live for 25 years without allowing yourself happiness. It's a self-imposed sentence," she acknowledged. "But lately, since reconnecting with you, since talking with David, I've begun to hope that perhaps redemption is possible. Not forgetting or erasing what I did, but finding a way forward that honors the past without being eternally punished by it." I nodded, understanding the sentiment more than I wanted to admit. Wasn't I too seeking a way forward that acknowledged the pain of abandonment without letting it define my entire existence? "Good night, Margaret," I said, using her first name deliberately, a small but significant shift in our evolving relationship. "Good night, Alexandra," she replied, a tentative smile touching her lips. "I'll see you Monday." As I closed the door behind her, I felt another piece of the heavy weight I had carried for 25 years begin to lift. Not disappear completely, I doubted it ever would, but shift, become lighter, more manageable somehow. 25 years ago, my mother had walked out of my life without explanation, leaving a wound that had shaped my entire existence. Now she had walked back in, bringing with her painful truths, but also the possibility of healing, of answers, of a relationship I had never dared to imagine having again. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning. 3 months after my mother re-entered my life, or I re-entered hers, depending on perspective, we settled into a cautious but steadily warming relationship. At work, she remained my highly efficient executive assistant, managing my professional life with skill and discretion. Outside of work, we were slowly building something that resembled a mother-daughter relationship, though one deeply shaped by our unusual history. We had dinner together once a week, usually at a quiet restaurant where we could talk freely. Sometimes we discussed mundane topics, books we'd read, films we'd seen, the frustrations of Manhattan real estate. Other times we delved into the more challenging territory of our shared past, filling in the blanks of 25 missed years. "Did you ever try to find me?" I asked one evening over pasta at a small Italian place in the village. "Before you saw me at that conference, I mean." She set down her fork, considering the question. "I looked you up online occasionally," she admitted. "Checked for your name in databases, once those became common. I knew you were with your father, that you were safe and provided for. But it never went beyond that. I was afraid of what I might find. Afraid you were thriving without me, and equally afraid you weren't." "A classic no-win scenario," I observed. "Of my own making," she added, accepting responsibility as she always did now. I had come to appreciate that about her, the unflinching way she acknowledged her failures. There were no excuses, no attempts to rewrite history or paint herself in a better light. She had made terrible choices and she owned them completely. "What about you?" she asked. "Did you ever try to find me?" "Dad hired a private investigator when I was 16, I revealed. "I was going through a difficult phase, angry, rebellious, acting out at school. He thought maybe if I could at least talk to you, get some answers, it might help." Her expression tightened with pain. "I didn't know that. The PI tracked you to Boston, found out you were married with 2 sons. Dad asked me if I wanted him to make contact, to try to arrange a meeting. I swirled the wine in my glass, remembering that tumultuous time. I said no. I was too angry then, too hurt. I thought if I saw you, I might say unforgivable things, might try to hurt you the way I'd been hurt." "That would have been your right," she said softly. "Maybe," I conceded, "but it wouldn't have helped either of us. I wasn't ready then. And now?" she asked, the question that hovered beneath all our interactions. "Are you ready now?" I considered this carefully. "I think I'm ready to try," I said finally. "To see if we can build something new from the ashes of what was lost. Not a traditional mother-daughter relationship, that opportunity is long gone. But something meaningful, perhaps." She reached across the table, hesitantly touching my hand, the first time she had initiated physical contact between us. "That's all I can ask for, Alexandra. A chance to know the remarkable woman you've become." I didn't pull away from her touch. It was a small gesture but significant for both of us, a tentative bridge across the chasm of years. The following weekend, I had dinner with my father, as I did most Sundays. These dinners had been our tradition since I moved out of his house after college, a way to maintain our close bond despite busy schedules and separate lives. "How are things with Margaret?" he asked as we sat in his dining room, sharing the pot roast he had prepared. My father had become an excellent cook out of necessity after my mother left, another skill he had mastered in her absence. "Evolving," I said honestly. "It's complicated. Some days I feel like we're making real progress, building a relationship that could actually mean something. Other days, the anger comes flooding back, and I can barely look at her without remembering that she chose to miss my entire childhood." Dad nodded, understanding in his eyes. "That anger might never completely disappear, Alley Cat." And that's okay. You don't need to forgive her to have a relationship with her now. That seems contradictory, I pointed out. How can I have a meaningful relationship with someone I haven't forgiven? He smiled slightly. Forgiveness isn't binary, Allie. It's not something you either have or don't have. It's a process, sometimes a lifelong one. You can be angry about the past while still being open to the present and future. As always, my father's wisdom cut through my tangled emotions with startling clarity. I didn't have to resolve 25 years of abandonment before I could allow my mother into my life now. I could hold both things simultaneously, the pain of what had been lost and the possibility of what might still be gained. She wants me to meet her sons, I told him. My half-brothers. His eyebrows rose slightly. And how do you feel about that? Nervous, curious, a little resentful, if I'm being honest. I pushed a carrot around my plate. They got to have her their whole lives. They don't even know I exist. That's not their fault, Dad reminded me gently. I know, I sighed. And it's not fair to punish them for her choices. They might be nice. Good to know. Family I never expected to have. There's no rush, Allie. You can take all the time you need to decide if and when you want to meet them. He reached across the table to squeeze my hand. And whatever you decide, I'll support you. Always have, always will. The certainty of his support, the unwavering constancy of his presence in my life, brought tears to my eyes. I know, Dad. You've never let me down, not once in 30 years. His eyes grew misty, too. Being your father has been the greatest privilege of my life, Alley Cat. Don't ever doubt that. Later that night, after returning to my apartment, I made a decision. I texted Margaret, I think I'm ready to meet your sons. When would be a good time? Her response came almost immediately. They'll be in NYC next weekend for James's birthday. I haven't told them about you yet. I wanted to ask your permission first. I appreciated that she was letting me control the narrative, allowing me to decide how and when this revelation would occur. It was a small thing, but it showed a respect for my autonomy that the Margaret of 25 years ago had never demonstrated. Tell them, I wrote back, and let me know when we can meet. The next day at work, Margaret was unusually quiet, her professional efficiency intact, but a preoccupied air about her. When she brought me my afternoon tea, she lingered by my desk. I told them last night, she said, about you. About everything. I looked up from my computer. How did they take it? They were shocked, of course, she admitted, angry with me for keeping such a huge secret, but also eager to meet you, especially once they Googled you and discovered who you are professionally. I raised an eyebrow. So they're impressed by my resume, if not my genetic connection? They're impressed by both, she corrected gently. They've always wanted a sister. Finding out they have one who also happens to be a successful CEO is just bonus material. I couldn't help but smile at that. Well, I hope I don't disappoint. You couldn't, she said with such conviction that I felt a warm flutter in my chest, an unfamiliar feeling when it came to my mother. They suggested dinner Saturday. At my apartment. Would that work for you? The thought of sitting down to a family dinner with my mother and half-brothers in her home was surreal, a scene from someone else's life, not mine. But I found myself nodding. Yes, that would work. Should I bring anything? Just yourself, she assured me. That's more than enough. Saturday arrived with unexpected speed. I spent an embarrassing amount of time deciding what to wear, rejecting outfit after outfit as too formal, too casual, too severe, too approachable. In the end, I settled on dark jeans, a cream silk blouse, and a tailored jacket, professional enough to maintain my dignity, but not so formal as to create unnecessary distance. Margaret had texted me her address, an apartment in a doorman building on the Upper West Side. Nice but not extravagant, much like her office attire. I arrived at precisely 7 p.m., bearing a bottle of wine despite her assurance that I didn't need to bring anything. Some social conventions were too deeply ingrained to ignore. When she opened the door, the nervousness on her face mirrored my own. "Alexandra, welcome," she said, stepping aside to let me in. "Michael and James are in the living room." I followed her through a short hallway into a warmly furnished living room where two men stood as we entered. The family resemblance was immediately apparent. Both had our mother's dark hair and eyes, though they were tall like their father must have been. Michael, the older one at 30, had a serious air about him that reminded me somewhat of myself. James, 28, had a more open, expressive face. "Alexandra," Margaret said formally. "These are my sons, Michael and James Wilson. Boys, this is your sister, Alexandra Calloway." There was an awkward moment of silence as we all absorbed the reality of this meeting. Then James stepped forward, his hand extended. "It's really good to meet you," he said with genuine warmth. "This is weird, right? It's not just me?" His candor broke the tension, and I found myself smiling as I shook his hand. "Definitely weird," I agreed. "But good weird, I think." Michael approached next, his handshake firm and professional. "It's an honor to meet you," he said. "I've followed your work at Callaway Tech for years, actually. I had no idea we were connected. Small world," I replied, unsure how else to respond to this revelation. "Please sit down," Margaret urged, gesturing to the sofa. "Dinner's almost ready, but I thought we might have a drink first. Break the ice a little." We settled in the living room, Margaret pouring wine for everyone. The conversation started haltingly, none of us quite sure how to navigate this unprecedented situation. But gradually, as the wine loosened tongues and initial nervousness faded, we began to talk more naturally. I learned that Michael was indeed a pediatrician, specializing in adolescent medicine. James taught high school English and coached the debate team. Both were unmarried but in serious relationships. They had grown up in a Boston suburb, had attended good colleges, Harvard for Michael, Tufts for James, and maintained close relationships with both their parents despite the divorce. In turn, they asked about my life, some professional questions, which I answered easily, and some more personal ones, which were harder to navigate. "What was it like growing up with just your dad?" James asked, his expression genuinely curious rather than pitying. "It was normal for me," I replied honestly. "Dad was extraordinary. He managed to be both parents somehow. He never missed a school event, helped with homework, taught me to play baseball and change a tire, and still managed to run his business. We were a team." "He sounds amazing," Michael said, a hint of something like envy in his voice. "Our dad was present, but not particularly involved. Mom was always the one we counted on for the day-to-day stuff." I felt a twinge of resentment at this, the reminder that she had been a dedicated mother to them while abandoning me, but I pushed it aside. "He is amazing. I'm very lucky to have him." "And you worked together at Callaway Tech?" James asked. "We did for many years," I confirmed. "He retired about 8 years ago. He started the company when I was a child, and I joined straight out of college, working my way up before taking over as CEO." "That must have been a proud moment for him," Michael observed, "seeing his daughter take over the company he built." "It was," I agreed, smiling at the memory. "He gave me a nameplate for my new office that said Alexandra Calloway, CEO and Alley Cat. It's still on my desk, though I don't let anyone but him call me Alley Cat." Margaret, who had been quietly listening to this exchange, smiled sadly. "Your father always had the best nicknames for you. Even when you were tiny, you were his alley cat." It was the first time she had volunteered a memory from my early childhood, and it caught me off guard. Did she actually remember these small details from a time she had seemed so emotionally absent? Or was she manufacturing memories to fit the narrative now? Before I could decide how to respond, she stood. "Dinner should be ready. Shall we move to the table?" The dining room, like the rest of the apartment, was tastefully decorated but not ostentatious. The table was set carefully, with nice china and crystal glasses. Clearly an effort had been made for this occasion. The meal was simple but well prepared: roast chicken, rosemary potatoes, asparagus, and a salad. "Did you cook all this?" I asked Margaret, somewhat surprised. "Mom's actually a great cook," James said before she could answer. Sunday dinners at her place were the highlight of our week growing up. Another revelation, another glimpse of the mother she had been to them, so different from the mother I remembered. The Margaret of my earliest memories had rarely cooked, often serving frozen dinners or takeout, claiming exhaustion or disinterest in kitchen work. "It looks delicious," I said diplomatically, taking my seat. As we ate, the conversation continued to flow more easily. Michael and James were both intelligent and articulate, with a sibling dynamic that was fascinating to observe: the gentle ribbing, inside jokes, and shorthand communication of people who had grown up together. I found myself warming to them despite my initial reservations, envying the bond they shared, but also appreciating their efforts to include me in their interactions. "So when did you find out about us?" Michael asked directly during a lull in the conversation. "Did you always know you had brothers? Or was this a recent revelation? I glanced at Margaret, who looked uncomfortable but didn't intervene. I only found out a few months ago, I admitted. When your mother and I reconnected. That must have been a shock, James said. Finding out you have siblings after 30 years? It was, I agreed, but a good shock, I think. I always wanted siblings growing up. We always wanted a sister, James replied with a warm smile. Though I have to admit, finding out our sister is a CEO who's been featured in Forbes is a bit intimidating. I laughed at that, surprised by how genuine it felt. Trust me, being a pediatrician or molding young minds is far more important work than what I do. Maybe we can all agree we're equally impressive in our own ways, Michael suggested with a smile that softened his serious demeanor. As dinner progressed, I found myself relaxing, genuinely enjoying the company of these newfound brothers. They were good men, as Margaret had described, intelligent, thoughtful, with a sense of humor and kindness that made them easy to like. It wasn't their fault that our mother had made the choices she had. They were as much products of her decisions as I was, just on the other side of the equation. After dessert, a lemon tart that Margaret admitted she had purchased from a local bakery, we moved back to the living room for coffee. The conversation had shifted to more personal territories, with Michael and James sharing stories from their childhood that involved our mother. Remember when Mom came to career day in 5th grade and brought those plastic organs to show the class? James laughed. Everyone else's parents were like, I'm an accountant, I work with numbers, and Mom's there with a plastic liver saying, this is what happens when you drink too much alcohol, children. Margaret blushed. I was volunteering at the hospital then. I thought it would be educational. It was, James assured her. Tommy Peterson didn't touch beer until college because of that liver. I listened to these stories with a complicated mix of emotions, enjoying them as entertaining anecdotes while simultaneously processing that this engaged educational mother was the same woman who had walked out of my life without a backward glance. What about you, Alexandra? Michael asked. Any memorable school moments with your dad? I considered the question, then smiled as a memory surfaced. When I was in 7th grade, we had a father-daughter dance. Dad was swamped with work. A major client project was due that same week. But he not only came to the dance, he took ballroom dancing lessons beforehand so he wouldn't embarrass me. He showed up in a tuxedo with a corsage for me and danced every dance. That's really sweet, James said sincerely. He's a good man, Margaret added softly. He always put you first. The unspoken contrast hung in the air, unlike her, who had put her own needs first. But there was no accusation in her tone, just a simple acknowledgement of a truth we all recognized. As the evening wound down, Michael and James both exchanged phone numbers with me, expressing genuine interest in keeping in touch. We're both in town until Tuesday, Michael said. Maybe we could have lunch one day, just the three of us. Get to know each other without... He glanced at Margaret, then back to me. Without the complicated history in the room. I appreciated his candor and the gesture behind it. I'd like that, I agreed. Monday works for me, if that's good for you both. As I prepared to leave, Margaret walked me to the door while her sons stayed in the living room, giving us a moment of privacy. Thank you for coming, she said sincerely. It meant a lot to all of us. They're good men, I acknowledged. You did well with them. Pain flashed in her eyes at the implied comparison. I did better with them than I did with you, she corrected gently. But that doesn't mean I did well enough. They've both had their own struggles because of my choices. I raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? She sighed. Michael has always been cautious about commitment, fearful of repeating my mistakes, I think. And James struggled with trust issues in relationships for years. My leaving your father, the eventual truth about their birth, it affected them too, just differently. It hadn't occurred to me that her sons might also bear scars from her decisions, albeit different ones than mine. The thought was oddly comforting, not because I wanted them to have suffered, but because it reinforced that her failings weren't about me specifically, but about her own limitations as a human being. I'm glad I came, I said honestly. It was a good evening. She smiled, relief evident in her expression. It was. And Alexandra? Thank you for giving them a chance. They didn't know about you, but now that they do, I think you'll find they very much want to be your brothers, if you'll let them. As I rode the elevator down to the lobby, I reflected on the evening. Meeting Michael and James had been less difficult than I had anticipated. They were separate from the pain of my mother's abandonment, innocent participants in a story they hadn't written, and there was something appealing about the idea of having siblings, of expanding my small family unit beyond just me and Dad. The lunch with my half-brothers on Monday went even better than the dinner. Without our mother present, the conversation flowed more naturally, ranging from our careers to our personal lives, our hobbies and interests. We discovered shared traits. All three of us were avid readers, enjoyed strategy games, and had a similar dry sense of humor that we'd apparently inherited from somewhere in our shared genetic code. "It's weird," James observed as we finished our meal. "I feel like I've known you a lot longer than 2 days." "Genetics are powerful," Michael agreed. "There are mannerisms you have that are so familiar, even though we've never met before." I had noticed it too, the way both brothers had a habit of tilting their heads slightly when considering a question, exactly as I did. The way James gestured with his hands when making a point, similar to my own conversational habits. Small things that spoke to our shared DNA, regardless of our separated upbringing. "Will you keep in touch?" I asked as we prepared to part ways. "After you go back to the West Coast?" "Try and stop us," James replied with a grin. "You're stuck with us now, big sister." The term sent an unexpected wave of emotion through me. Big sister. A role I had never anticipated having, an identity I had never claimed. Yet here it was, offered freely by these men who seemed genuinely happy to have discovered my existence. "I think I can live with that," I said, returning his smile. Over the next few months, our relationship continued to develop. We texted regularly, had video calls every few weeks, and began building the foundations of a genuine sibling relationship. They shared details of their lives with me, asked my advice on various matters, and treated me like I had always been their sister, just one who lived on the opposite coast. Meanwhile, my relationship with Margaret continued its cautious evolution. At work, she remained my efficient professional assistant. Outside of work, we maintained our weekly dinners, gradually filling in the 25-year gap in our knowledge of each other's lives. 6 months after she had walked back into my life, or I had walked into hers, she arrived at our usual restaurant with an unusually serious expression. "What's wrong?" I asked as we took our seats. She took a deep breath. "I've been offered a job. A good one, with a non-profit organization that supports single parents. It would mean leaving Callaway Tech." I blinked, surprised by the unexpected news. "That sounds like a perfect fit for you," I said carefully, "given your personal experience from both sides of that equation." She nodded. "It would be meaningful work, a chance to help others avoid the mistakes I made, perhaps. But," she hesitated, "I'm concerned about what it would mean for us. For this relationship we've been building." The implication was clear. She feared that without the structure of our work relationship, without the guaranteed daily contact it provided, our tentative reconnection might falter. And she wasn't entirely wrong to worry. Our professional interactions had provided a framework, a reason to push through the difficult early days when the weight of the past had threatened to overwhelm us both. "When would you start?" I asked. "They'd like me to begin after the new year," she replied. "About 6 weeks from now." I considered this carefully. 6 months ago, I might have been relieved at the prospect of my mother leaving Callaway Tech, removing the constant reminder of our complicated history from my professional life. But now, the thought of not seeing her every day produced an unexpected twinge of sadness. "I think you should take it," I said finally. "It sounds like work that would be fulfilling for you. And as for us," I met her gaze directly, "we don't need the structure of a workplace to maintain our relationship anymore. We can still have our dinners, still talk, still be in each other's lives." Relief washed over her face. "You're sure?" "I don't want to jeopardize the progress we've made." "I'm sure," I confirmed. "Besides, it might be healthier this way. Separate our professional and personal relationship." She reached across the table, hesitantly taking my hand, a gesture that had become more frequent between us in recent months. "Thank you, Alexandra. Your support means more than I can express." I squeezed her hand briefly before withdrawing mine. "You'll need to train your replacement, of course. I still expect the same level of efficiency in my office." She smiled, recognizing the deliberate shift back to safer professional territory. "Of course. I wouldn't leave you in the lurch." 2 weeks later, I announced to the executive team that Margaret Wilson would be leaving Callaway Tech at the end of the year to pursue an opportunity in the nonprofit sector. I thanked her for her exemplary service and outlined the transition plan for her replacement. It was all very proper, very professional, CEO and executive assistant parting ways amicably. Only a few people knew the deeper truth, that this wasn't just a professional separation, but another milestone in a complex personal journey between mother and daughter. My father knew, of course. And Michael and James, who had become regular presences in my life through texts, calls, and occasional visits. Margaret's last day at Callaway Tech fell on December 30th. I had arranged a small farewell gathering in the conference room. Cake, champagne, the usual corporate send-off. She accepted the well wishes of her colleagues with grace, thanking everyone for making her time at the company so rewarding. At the end of the day, when the office had emptied and only the two of us remained, she came to my office one last time, no longer carrying her ever-present tablet. "Well," she said, standing somewhat awkwardly at the threshold, "I guess this is it, professionally speaking at least." I gestured for her to sit. "You've been an excellent assistant, Margaret. The nonprofit is lucky to have you." "Thank you," she said. "It's been an honor to work for you, Alexandra, to see firsthand the remarkable leader you've become." There was a moment of silence between us, the weight of our shared history filling the space. "I have something for you," I said finally, reaching into my desk drawer. "A parting gift." I handed her a small box, watching as she opened it with careful fingers. Inside was a silver bracelet, similar to the one she always wore, the gift from her sons, but with 3 small charms, an M, a J, and an A. Her eyes filled with tears as she lifted it from the box. "Alexandra, Michael and James helped me pick it out," I explained. We thought you might like having all 3 of your children represented." She slipped the bracelet onto her wrist beside the one she already wore, her hands trembling slightly. "It's perfect," she whispered. "Thank you." I stood, signaling the end of our professional relationship. "We still on for dinner Friday? Our usual place?" She nodded, wiping away a tear as she rose to her feet. "I'll be there." "Good," I said simply. "Because this isn't an ending, Margaret. It's just a transition." She smiled through her tears. "When did you get so wise?" "I had good examples," I replied. "My father, and eventually my mother too." The words were out before I fully realized what I had said. It was the first time I had referred to her as my mother to her face since our reconnection. The impact was immediately visible in her expression, a flash of surprise followed by deep emotion. "Thank you for saying that," she said softly. "It means more than you know." As she left my office for the final time as my employee, I felt a sense of closure that had nothing to do with professional transitions and everything to do with personal evolution. 6 months ago, I had hired my long-lost mother as my assistant, driven by a complex mix of curiosity, anger, and a desire for some form of justice or revenge. What I had found instead was something far more valuable: understanding, context for the abandonment that had shaped my life, and the possibility, just the possibility, of healing a wound that had defined me for 25 years. The revenge I had initially sought now seemed hollow, even childish. What purpose would it have served to humiliate her, to make her suffer, to reject her as she had once rejected me? It wouldn't have changed the past. It wouldn't have filled the empty space she had left in my life. It would only have perpetuated the cycle of pain, passing it back and forth between us like a toxic inheritance. Instead, I had chosen a different path, slower, more difficult, infinitely more complex. The path of cautious reconnection, of careful rebuilding, of seeing my mother not as the mythologized figure of my childhood pain, but as a flawed human being who had made terrible choices and lived with their consequences. I wasn't ready to fully forgive her. Perhaps I never would be. But I had found something I hadn't expected when she walked back into my life: the possibility of moving forward without forgetting the past, of acknowledging the pain while refusing to let it dictate my future. And in that unexpected space between resentment and reconciliation, I had discovered not only a mother I never truly knew, but brothers I never knew existed. An expanded definition of family that somehow made the original wound less defining, less all-encompassing. As I gathered my things to leave the office, I glanced at the nameplate on my desk, the one my father had given me when I became CEO. Alexandra Callaway, CEO and Alley Cat. A reminder of the man who had never left, who had been both mother and father, who had shaped me with his constant presence just as surely as my mother had shaped me with her absence. But now there were new names to add to my story. Margaret, Michael, James. Not replacements for what had been lost, but additions to what remained. Proof that even the most painful stories could have unexpected chapters, that even the deepest wounds could find, if not healing, then purpose. As I switched off my office light, I thought about the 5-year-old girl who had stood at the window waiting for her mother to return. She was still part of me, would always be part of me. But she wasn't the whole of me anymore. She was just one character in a much larger, more complex story, a story that was still being written, still unfolding in ways I could never have imagined. I smiled as I stepped into the elevator. My mother had abandoned me at 5 years old. 25 years later, I had become her boss. And now, most surprising of all, I was cautiously becoming her daughter again, on my own terms, in my own time, with the wisdom of the woman I had become guiding the choices of the child I once was. It wasn't the revenge I had planned. It was something far more valuable. It was redemption, for us both.